I was sitting in a quiet, high-end coffee shop in downtown Boston, staring blindly at an age-progressed photo of my missing son when the man sitting across from me shattered my reality. He looked at the picture, then looked me dead in the eye and said, "You are still looking for him." Before I could even ask who he was, he set a thick manila folder down on the table. He leaned in and whispered, "Everything about the kidnapping 30 years ago is right in here." I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. I asked him how he could possibly know anything about it. He did not blink. He simply said, "Because I am the kid in that photo." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to the very people you thought you could trust the most. Your support means everything to me. My name is Richard Caldwell. I am 70 years old, and I have spent my entire adult life building a logistics and real estate empire from absolutely nothing. I am a man who is used to having power. I control shipping routes across the eastern seaboard. I manage thousands of employees. I sit in glass boardrooms and make decisions that move millions of dollars with a single signature. But for all my wealth, for all the influence I have accumulated, I have spent the last 3 decades completely powerless over the one thing that truly mattered to me. My youngest son, Leo. 30 years ago, when Leo was just 4 years old, he vanished without a trace during a family weekend getaway. One moment he was playing, and the next he was gone. The police searched for months. We hired the best private investigators in the country. I spent millions of dollars on media campaigns, offering massive rewards to anyone who could give me a single clue. But the trail was completely cold. My wife Diane was absolutely devastated. She spent years heavily medicated mourning the boy we lost. Our older son Bradley, who is now 38 and the chief financial officer of my company, practically grew up in the shadow of that tragedy. I spent my life trying to provide a perfect existence for Diane and Bradley, trying to compensate for the massive hole in our family. Even my daughter-in-law Valerie enjoys a life of absolute luxury because I wanted my family to never feel pain or worry ever again. But the pain never truly leaves you. Every year on Leo's birthday, the private investigation agency I keep on retainer sends me an updated age-progressed photograph. They use computer software to predict what he would look like today at 34 years old. That is what I was looking at in the coffee shop. The rain was beating against the large glass windows of the cafe. The air smelled of roasted espresso and damp coats. I was completely lost in my own grief, tracing the imaginary lines of my son's face on the glossy paper, wondering where he was, wondering if he was even alive. That was when the chair across from me scraped against the wooden floor. I looked up, annoyed by the intrusion. A man sat down. He was rugged, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark canvas jacket that dripped with rainwater. He had a hard, weathered face, the kind of face that belonged to someone who had lived a very difficult life. He looked to be in his mid-30s. I opened my mouth to tell him that this table was private, but the words died in my throat. He was staring at the photograph in my hands. Then he delivered the words that stopped my breathing. He claimed he was Leo. He claimed he was the boy in the picture. For a moment, all the background noise in the coffee shop completely faded away. The hiss of the espresso machine, the chatter of the other customers, the rain against the glass. It all went completely silent. I stared at his face. I desperately searched his eyes, his jawline, the shape of his nose, looking for a trace of my wife, a trace of myself. My hands began to shake uncontrollably. After 30 years of agonizing dead ends, after decades of waking up in cold sweats, was it possible? Was my boy actually sitting right in front of me? I felt a sudden, overwhelming surge of emotion. Tears burned in my eyes. I reached my trembling hand across the small table. I wanted to touch his face. I wanted to pull him into a desperate hug and never let him go. I wanted to tell him that his father never stopped looking for him, that I never gave up hope. But as my hand moved closer to him, he leaned back. He dodged my touch completely. His eyes were entirely cold, calculating, and devoid of any emotion. I am not here for a sweet family reunion, Richard, he said, his voice flat and hard. He did not call me Dad. He called me Richard. The chill in his tone was like a bucket of ice water poured directly over my head. I pulled my hand back, confused and suddenly very cautious. I asked him what he meant. I asked him where he had been all these years, who had taken him, and why he was acting so hostile. He ignored my questions. Instead, he tapped the thick manila folder he had placed on the table. I have the answers, he said. I have the names. I know exactly what happened the day I disappeared, but I am not giving it to you out of the goodness of my heart. I want $2 million in cash, unmarked bills. I sat back in my chair, utterly stunned. My own son, or at least a man claiming to be my son, was sitting across from me, extorting me. My sharp business instincts, honed over decades of ruthless negotiations, immediately kicked in. The desperation faded, replaced by deep suspicion. I told him that I was not a fool. I told him that over the last 30 years, dozens of scammers had come forward claiming to be Leo, hoping to get their hands on my money. I demanded proof. I told him I needed a DNA test before I handed over a single dime. He let out a short, humorless laugh. He did not look intimidated. He looked entirely confident. "You want proof?" he asked quietly. He unzipped his jacket, opened the manila folder, and bypassed the stacks of photographs and typed documents. He pulled out a single piece of paper protected inside a clear plastic sleeve and slid it across the table toward me. "You think a random kidnapper snatched me out of a crowded park?" he asked, his voice dripping with absolute venom. "Look at the document, Richard. Tell me what you see." I put on my reading glasses with shaky fingers. I looked down at the paper. It was a highly confidential banking record. An old physical withdrawal slip from the Caldwell family trust. The date stamped at the top of the document caught my eye immediately. It was dated exactly 24 hours before the day Leo vanished. But it was the transaction details that made my blood run entirely cold. It was a massive cash withdrawal, $250,000. Back in the 90s, that was an absolutely staggering amount of cash to pull out of a bank without prior notice. I traced my finger down the page, moving toward the signature line at the bottom. My heart hammered against my ribs so violently, I thought I was going to collapse right there in the coffee shop. I had spent thousands of nights holding my wife while she wept for our missing child. I had paid for her therapy, her retreats, her endless pursuit of peace. Now, staring at the bold, sweeping loops of the cursive handwriting on that paper, I felt a nausea so profound, it threatened to empty my stomach. I knew that signature. I had seen it on checks, on anniversary cards, on mortgage documents for over 40 years. It was the signature of Diane Caldwell. My wife. My vision blurred. The air in the coffee shop suddenly felt suffocatingly heavy. I tried to inhale, but my lungs refused to expand. Why would my wife withdraw $250,000 in untraceable cash just one day before our son was taken from us? The question echoed in my mind, ringing with horrifying implications. The stranger stood up, towering over the table. He zipped his jacket up and stared down at me. "You have 48 hours to get my $2 million, Richard," he said quietly. "Or the rest of this folder goes to the press, and your perfect little family gets ripped to shreds." He turned and walked out of the coffee shop, disappearing into the heavy Boston rain. I sat there completely frozen, staring at my wife's signature on the old bank receipt. The grief I had carried for 30 years was suddenly eclipsed by something much darker. The realization that the monster who took my son might not have been a stranger at all. The monster might be sleeping in my own bed. I drove my Mercedes through the slick streets of downtown Boston, the tires hissing against the wet pavement. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. Every red light felt like a physical blow. The piece of paper sitting on the passenger seat seemed to burn a hole through the very fabric of my reality. $250,000. $250,000 in untraceable cash pulled directly from our family trust. The date stamped on that slip was a ghost rising from the grave. It was the exact day before our boy was taken from us. My mind raced through decades of memories trying to fit this grotesque puzzle piece into the picture of the grieving, fragile wife I had protected all these years. I turned onto the winding, tree-lined streets of Beacon Hill. The rain washed over the grand historic houses, but I could not appreciate any of it. I pulled into the private driveway of my estate. It was a $12 million fortress of stone and wrought iron, a place I had bought to make my family feel safe. I had paid for top-tier security systems, reinforced gates, and private patrols. I wanted to ensure that no one could ever touch my loved ones again. Now looking at the massive front doors, I felt like I was walking into a trap. I turned off the engine and sat in the silence for a heavy moment. I grabbed the manila folder, clutching it to my chest, and stepped out into the freezing rain. I unlocked the front door and pushed it open. The house was warm, smelling faintly of expensive vanilla candles and roasted garlic. From down the long, arched hallway, I could hear the faint sound of classical music playing in the kitchen. I heard the clinking of glassware. I heard laughter. It was a soft, casual laugh. It was Diane. She was talking to someone, her voice light and entirely untroubled. The sound of her joy made my stomach twist into painful knots. For 30 years, I had treated her like glass. I had shielded her from the press, from the police interviews, from the harsh reality of the world, because I thought the kidnapping had broken her spirit. I walked down the hallway, my wet shoes leaving heavy footprints on the polished hardwood floors. I stepped into the massive kitchen. The space was a masterpiece of imported Italian marble and custom lighting, all paid for by my sweat and my late nights at the office. Diane was standing by the massive central island, holding a crystal glass of red wine. She was wearing a silk blouse and her favorite pearl necklace. Standing next to her was our son Bradley. He was leaning casually against the counter, dressed in his tailored suit, holding a glass of scotch. He looked exactly like the confident, wealthy chief financial officer I had molded him to be. They both stopped talking the second I walked in. Diane turned to me, a warm, perfectly crafted smile spreading across her face. "You are home early, dear," she said smoothly. "The weather out there is absolutely dreadful. Bradley just stopped by to drop off the quarterly reports." I did not say a word. I did not greet my son. I did not take off my wet coat. I walked directly to the marble island. The silence in the room became incredibly thick, heavy with the sudden shift in my demeanor. I raised my hand and slammed the bank record down onto the pristine marble countertop. The loud smack echoed through the vast kitchen like a gunshot. Diane jumped. Bradley tensed his eyes, darting to the paper. "Look at it!" I demanded, my voice low, vibrating with a rage I had never allowed myself to show her before. Diane let out a nervous, confused laugh. She stepped closer to the island, peering down at the plastic sleeve. I watched her face. I watched the exact moment her eyes registered the date and the amount. I watched the recognition hit her brain. All the color instantly drained from her skin. She turned ashen, looking as though all the blood had been siphoned from her body. The crystal wine glass slipped from her fingers. It hit the marble floor, shattering into 100 sharp pieces. The dark red wine splattered across the white stone like a pool of fresh blood. Diane stumbled backward, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. She gasped a horrible choking sound, and then she began to hyperventilate. Her chest heaved. Her knees gave out, and she sank against the custom cabinets, her perfectly styled exterior completely crumbling into a display of absolute terror. I did not move to comfort her. I did not reach out to catch her. For the first time in our 45-year marriage, I looked at my wife with pure, unadulterated disgust. "I want an answer, Diane," I said, my voice cutting through her hysterical, gasping sobs. "I want to know why you went to the bank 30 years ago. I want to know why you quietly emptied $250,000 in cash from our trust fund. And I want to know why you did it exactly 24 hours before our son vanished." Diane could not speak. She just shook her head frantically, pulling at her hair, her eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic panic. She opened her mouth, but only choked, breathless sounds came out. She was trying to act like a victim, trying to play the fragile, broken woman I was supposed to rush to protect. I stepped closer, ignoring the broken glass crunching beneath my shoes. "Did you pay someone?" I demanded, the volume of my voice rising. "Did you pay someone to take him? Did you owe someone money? Tell me the truth right now." She wailed, a high-pitched, piercing sound that scraped against my eardrums. I was done being patient. I was done playing the gentle husband. I reached down to grab her arm, to pull her up and force her to look me in the eye. But before my fingers could even touch her sleeve, a hand clamped down hard on my shoulder. I was shoved backward with surprising force. I stumbled, catching my balance against the edge of the island. I looked up, stunned. It was Bradley. He had stepped directly between me and his mother. His jaw was clenched, his shoulders squared. He stood tall, looking down at me with an expression that made the breath catch in my throat. It was not anger. It was not confusion. It was pity. A cold, calculated, deeply condescending pity. "Dad, stop," Bradley said firmly. His voice was entirely steady, completely lacking the shock a son should feel when viewing a document that implicated his mother in his brother's disappearance. He did not look at the bank record again. He did not ask what it was. He already knew. He placed a protective hand on Diane's trembling shoulder, keeping his cold gaze locked dead on mine. "Just stop, Dad." He repeated, his tone smooth, almost soothing, as if he were trying to calm down a confused, erratic patient. "You are scaring her. You are taking things entirely out of context." "Out of context," I shouted, gesturing wildly at the paper on the counter. "She pulled out enough cash to buy a house the day before Leo was kidnapped. What context could possibly explain that?" Bradley let out a long, heavy sigh. He looked at me with that same sickening pity, shaking his head slowly, as if burdened by a heavy, unfortunate truth. "She did not want you to know," he said quietly. "She paid the ransom, Dad." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The kitchen was completely silent, save for Diane's muffled crying on the floor. I stared at my son, trying to process the sheer audacity of his statement. My mind raced, colliding with a brick wall of impossibility. "What are you talking about?" I whispered, the rage faltering for a split second. Bradley stepped forward, his posture authoritative, commanding the space in my house. "The kidnappers contacted her first," he said, his voice entirely unbothered. "They called the house a day before the police were involved. They demanded $250,000. They told her that if she told you with your temper, with your need to control everything, they would kill Leo immediately. So she went to the bank. She got the cash. She made the drop to save him." He looked down at his mother, then back at me. "And they took the money and never gave him back. She has lived with that guilt for 30 years, Dad. She hid it to protect you from the truth." I looked at Diane, still sobbing on the floor. I looked at Bradley, the perfect, composed chief financial officer. It was the perfect excuse. It played on my temper, on her fragility, on the tragedy of the situation. It was a plausible lie designed to shut down my questions instantly. But as I stood there looking into my son's eyes, 40 years of crushing business opponents told me everything I needed to know. The slight relaxation of his shoulders, the almost imperceptible smirk hidden in the corner of his mouth, the way his heart rate had not spiked at all. He was lying. They were both lying to my face. My family was hiding a monster, and the hunt had just begun. I stood frozen in my magnificent kitchen, surrounded by the finest imported materials money could buy, and I had never felt so utterly betrayed in my entire life. The rain continued to batter the large windows of the estate, casting long, dark shadows across the marble floors. I looked down at the bank receipt resting on the counter. The blue ink of the teller stamp was faded, but the implications were sharply in focus. Bradley expected me to fold. He expected me to fall to my knees, to apologize for opening old wounds, to comfort my weeping wife. He thought I was just a tired old man who would swallow a convenient tragedy rather than face an ugly, complicated truth. But I had not built a billion-dollar logistics empire by accepting convenient lies. I had built it by noticing the tiny discrepancies that others ignored. And right now, the biggest discrepancy was standing right in front of me. Why did Bradley, who was only 8 years old at the time of the kidnapping, know the exact details of a secret ransom drop? And why did his eyes look so incredibly cold? I took a slow, deep breath, letting the icy realization wash over me. I forced my expression to soften. I made my shoulders slump, playing the exact role they expected me to play. I nodded slowly, letting out a broken, defeated sigh. I stepped around Bradley and knelt beside Diane, wrapping my arms around her trembling shoulders. I whispered apologies into her ear, telling her I was so sorry for bringing it up. But as I held my sobbing wife, my eyes met Bradley's over her shoulder. The war had silently begun, and I was going to destroy them all. Bradley kept his arm firmly positioned in front of me, acting as a physical barrier between my mounting fury and his weeping mother. He let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, shaking his head as if he were carrying the weight of the entire world on his tailored shoulders. He walked over to the stainless steel refrigerator, retrieved a crystal tumbler, and filled it with chilled water from the dispenser. His movements were incredibly deliberate, projecting an aura of absolute calm that starkly contrasted with Diane's frantic sobbing on the marble floor. He crouched down beside her, pressing the cold glass into her trembling hands. "Drink this, Mom," he murmured gently, his voice echoing in the tense silence of the massive kitchen. "You need to breathe. Just take a slow breath." Diane choked back a sob, gripping the glass so tightly I thought it might shatter between her palms. She took a tiny, ragged sip, her chest still heaving with panicked breaths. Bradley stood up slowly, smoothing the front of his expensive suit jacket. He turned to face me, his expression hardening into a mask of weary patience. "You want the truth, Dad?" he asked, his voice remarkably steady and low. "You want to know what happened to that money? Fine. I will tell you because she is too terrified to say the words herself." I stood silently, folding my arms across my chest, waiting for the performance to begin. My son looked me directly in the eye, not a single trace of hesitation in his gaze. 30 years ago, Bradley began pacing slowly across the kitchen. The day before the police were ever called, Mom received a phone call at the house. "You were at the office, as you always were, closing some massive shipping deal. You were unreachable, stressed, and volatile." The man on the other end of the line told her they had Leo. They told her that if she breathed a single word of this to the authorities or to you, they would hurt him. They demanded $250,000 in untraceable cash. They gave her exactly 12 hours to get the money together. I listened to his words, keeping my face entirely blank. Diane let out another piercing wail from the floor, burying her face in her hands. "She was terrified of you, Dad." Bradley continued, his voice dripping with righteous indignation. "She knew your explosive temper. She knew that if she told you about the ransom demand, you would have tried to take control. You would have called your security team. You would have involved the police. You would have turned the entire thing into a tactical war zone, and the kidnappers would have panicked. She was a desperate, terrified mother trying to do everything in her power to save her innocent little boy from a horrific situation. So she made a choice. She went to the bank the very next morning. She withdrew the money exactly as they instructed. She drove to a designated drop point at the edge of the city and left the briefcase in a dumpster, praying they would give her son back." Bradley stopped pacing and stood right in front of me, leaning in slightly to emphasize his next words. "But they took the cash, Dad. They took the money, and they never brought Leo home. The next day you noticed he was missing from the yard, the police were called, and the circus began. She was too ashamed, too utterly broken by her failure to ever admit what she had done. She has carried the guilt of that failed ransom drop every single day for 30 years, and you are standing here interrogating her like she is a criminal." Diane scrambled up from the floor, leaning heavily against the island for support. Her mascara was smeared down her cheeks, and her silk blouse was stained with spilled wine. She threw herself toward me, wrapping her arms around my waist, collapsing to her knees right at my feet. "I am so sorry," "Richard," she wailed, burying her face into my coat. "I am so sorry. I thought I was doing the right thing. I just wanted my baby back. I thought if I just paid them, they would let him go. Please forgive me. It was just foolish motherly desperation. I was so scared of what you would do. I did not want him to die because of your pride. Please, you have to believe me." Her tears soaked through the fabric of my trousers. The entire display was sickeningly pathetic. From the doorway of the kitchen, another voice suddenly sliced through the heavy emotional atmosphere. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Richard." I turned my head and saw Valerie, my daughter-in-law, leaning against the doorframe. She was wearing a silk robe, casually filing her nails, as if this entire situation were nothing more than a minor inconvenience interrupting her evening. "You are terrorizing your own wife over a scam artist's fake document," Valerie muttered, rolling her eyes dramatically. "Do you have any idea how ridiculous you look right now? Some grifter from a coffee shop hands you a piece of paper and you come storming in here acting like a dictator, traumatizing a woman who has already lost a child. You really should be ashamed of yourself, Richard. Grow up." I looked at Valerie, taking in her sheer arrogance and her total disrespect, then looked down at the weeping woman clinging to my legs. Every fiber of my being wanted to push Diane away, to demand answers, to tear this house apart until the truth bled out. But a successful businessman knows when to fold a bad hand. I let out a long breath, forcing my shoulders to drop. I reached down and gently pulled Diane up from the floor. I wrapped my arms around her trembling frame. I stroked her hair, murmuring soft apologies. "I am sorry, Diane," I whispered, making sure my voice sounded suitably broken and full of regret. "I am so sorry. You are right. I should not have reacted this way. I was just so shocked by the document. I know you were only trying to protect our boy. Please forgive me." As Diane wept into my chest, gripping my jacket, I opened my eyes. I looked over her shoulder at my son. Bradley was standing a few feet away, watching the reconciliation unfold. For a fraction of a second, his protective facade completely slipped. He caught my gaze. Then he shifted his eyes toward his wife in the doorway. He gave Valerie a quick, almost imperceptible smirk. It was a fleeting expression of absolute triumph, the look of a predator who had just successfully cornered his prey. That tiny, arrogant micro-expression told me everything I needed to know. My 40 years of ruthless corporate instincts screamed violently inside my head. I knew in my bones that they were both lying to my face. The ransom story was just a perfectly fabricated, calculated illusion designed to manipulate and deceive me. They were deliberately hiding something truly monstrous, and I was going to uncover every single dark, rotting secret they had buried. That evening, the grand house on Beacon Hill settled into a heavy, suffocating silence. Diane retreated to the master bedroom early, claiming a migraine, clutching a glass of water and her prescribed sedatives. I played the supportive, chastised husband flawlessly. I helped her into bed, pulled the heavy duvet over her trembling shoulders, and turned off the lamps. I lay there in the dark, perfectly still, listening to the rhythmic sound of her breathing as the medication finally pulled her under. Hours dragged by. The rain continued to lash against the bedroom windows, a relentless drumming that matched the pounding in my chest. When the illuminated numbers on the digital clock shifted to 2 in the morning, I finally moved. I slid out from under the covers with practiced silence. I did not bother with slippers or a robe. The cold hardwood floor bit into the soles of my feet as I navigated the sprawling, darkened hallways of the estate. Every shadow seemed to mock me, every luxurious fixture a reminder of the empire I had built for people who were completely deceiving me. I bypassed the main staircase and used the secondary elevator, stepping out into the secluded wing that housed my private study. This room was my sanctuary, heavily soundproofed and strictly off-limits to everyone, including Diane and the cleaning staff. I locked the heavy oak door behind me and closed the velvet blinds, plunging the room into absolute pitch black before reaching under the mahogany desk. I bypassed the sleek modern laptop sitting on the surface and pressed a concealed panel near the floorboard. A hidden drawer slid open, revealing an older, heavily encrypted terminal that I kept strictly air-gapped from our main corporate network. As a man who built a global logistics network, I never threw away foundational data. This terminal held the unalterable hard-coded financial archives of the Caldwell Family Trust, dating back to the very inception of my fortune. I powered the machine on. The low hum of the cooling fan felt loud in the total isolation of the study. The screen flickered to life, casting a harsh, pale blue glow across my face. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I had to bypass 3 separate security protocols and a biometric prompt before the antiquated database finally granted me access. My hands were remarkably steady now. The initial shock from the coffee shop had completely burned away, leaving behind a cold, clinical precision. I navigated through decades of financial history, scrolling past real estate acquisitions, massive shipping contracts, and philanthropic donations. I narrowed the search parameters to the spring of 1996. I entered the exact date stamped on the withdrawal slip the stranger had pushed across the cafe table. The system processed the query lines of green text cascading down the dark screen. And there it was. The $250,000 transaction. Diane had not lied about the amount, nor had she lied about the date. But as I stared at the digital ledger, my eyes narrowed. I was a man who moved thousands of shipping containers across the globe daily. I understood tracking. I understood the digital footprints that money always leaves behind. Bradley had spun a highly compelling narrative in the kitchen. He had painted a picture of a terrified mother, pulling $250,000 in untraceable paper bills to drop into a dirty suburban dumpster. It was a very tragic, cinematic story of desperation. But the cold, hard data glowing on the screen told an entirely different tale. The transaction code listed next to the amount was not for a physical cash withdrawal. It was a wire transfer code. My heart seized in my chest. You cannot wire cash to an anonymous kidnapper hiding in a park. Wire transfers require routing numbers, international SWIFT codes, and registered receiving entities. I tapped the keyboard, expanding the transaction details to reveal the destination of the funds. The screen flickered again, loading the archived banking route. The $250,000 had been electronically funneled through 3 different intermediary banks before finally settling into an offshore corporate account based in the Cayman Islands. The beneficiary name attached to that account was not a person. It was a shell company. I leaned closer to the monitor, reading the name aloud in the silent room. Apex Holdings. My breath hitched. The entire ransom drop story was an absolute fabrication. Diane did not leave cash in a dumpster for kidnappers. She wired a massive fortune to a ghost corporation. The sheer calculation required to execute that kind of financial maneuver completely contradicted the image of a panicked, grieving mother. I stared at the name Apex Holdings, letting the reality wash over me. But then a bizarre, nagging sensation crept into the back of my mind. The name of the shell company felt strangely familiar. The sickening familiarity was recent. It was something I had seen in passing, something buried deep in the endless spreadsheets I reviewed every single quarter. I rolled over to the modern laptop sitting on the desk. I opened it and logged into the active financial servers of my logistics empire. My hands were practically numb as I typed the name Apex Holdings into the global vendor search bar. I slowly hit the enter key. The system froze for a fraction of a second, processing the search across our vast network of international partners, suppliers, and consultants. Then the results populated the screen. I stopped breathing. The page was flooded with hundreds of line items. Apex Holdings was not a defunct entity from 1996. It was an active, highly compensated vendor in our current corporate ecosystem. I clicked on the most recent fiscal year and sorted the payments. Every single month, on the 15th day, a scheduled payment of $50,000 was wired from our central operating account directly to Apex Holdings. I scrolled down looking at the previous year. The exact same pattern, $50,000 a month. I expanded the search to a decade. For the last 10 years, my company had been steadily bleeding $500,000 annually to the exact same offshore shell company that received the supposed ransom money the day before my son vanished. I dragged my cursor over to the authorization column. I needed to see whose digital signature was approving these massive recurring payments. I already knew the answer in my gut, but seeing the name officially stamped on the ledger felt like a physical knife plunging into my stomach. The authorizing officer for every single transaction over the last decade was Bradley Caldwell. My son, my chief financial officer, the man who was supposed to inherit my entire legacy, had been meticulously funneling a fortune to the same entity tied to his brother's disappearance. Bradley was not protecting his mother from an old mistake. He was actively paying someone off right now. The silent, dark room suddenly spun violently around my head. My own son was deeply, inextricably linked to the darkest horror of my entire life, and he was using my hard-earned money to finance it. The sun rose over Boston the next morning, casting a pale gray light that offered absolutely no warmth. I had not slept a single minute. I spent the remaining hours of the night sitting in the dark of my study, staring at the glowing screen of the legacy terminal. Every time I blinked, I saw the offshore routing numbers. Every time I inhaled, I felt the crushing weight of the betrayal pressing down on my chest. But as the clock struck 6, I forced myself to stand. I walked to my private bathroom, splashed freezing water on my face, and dressed in my sharpest charcoal suit. A successful man does not go to war looking defeated. He goes to war looking like he owns the battlefield. I drove to the corporate headquarters of Caldwell Logistics, a towering glass and steel monolith in the financial district that I had built from a single delivery truck. When I walked through the revolving doors into the expansive marble lobby, I projected the exact same aura I had carried for 40 years. I nodded to the security guards. I smiled at the receptionists. I stepped into the private executive elevator and rode it to the top floor, acting entirely like a man whose world was in perfect order. Inside, my mind was running 1,000 calculations a second. I needed to see Bradley. I needed to look him in the eye now that I knew the truth about Apex Holdings. When the elevator doors parted on the executive floor, the plush carpet silenced my footsteps. I walked past the mahogany-paneled conference rooms toward the West Wing, where Bradley reigned as my chief financial officer. His administrative assistant was away from her desk, likely fetching his morning coffee. As I approached his heavy oak door, I realized I needed a plausible excuse for entering unannounced. I reached into my breast pocket, pulled out my reading glasses, and slipped them into the inner lining of my jacket. I would simply tell him I had left them in his suite during our meeting the previous afternoon. It was a mundane, trivial excuse perfectly suited for an aging father. I raised my hand to push the heavy door open, but I stopped. The door was already cracked open just a fraction of an inch, and I could hear voices drifting from inside. It was not just Bradley. Valerie was in there with him. This was highly unusual. My daughter-in-law despised the corporate office, finding it boring and beneath her socialite sensibilities. I stood perfectly still, pressing my back against the wall, just outside the frame, completely hidden from their line of sight. "You should have seen him," Valerie Bradley was saying. His voice was casual, almost amused, carrying the distinct tone of a man recounting a funny anecdote at a cocktail party. The old man bought the ransom story completely. He practically swallowed it whole. He spent 10 minutes on the floor, apologizing to Mom for upsetting her. I closed my eyes. The sheer casual cruelty in my son's voice was a physical strike. Valerie let out a sharp, dismissive sigh. "Thank God for that. I thought your mother was going to ruin everything. When she dropped that wine glass, I thought she was going to confess the whole thing right there. She is so incredibly weak, Bradley. She is a liability. If Richard had pushed her for even 2 more minutes, she would have cracked." "Mom is a mess," Bradley replied smoothly, the sound of ice clinking against glass echoing in the room. "But she will hold up. She has to." She is too terrified of losing her social standing to ever tell the truth. She knows I am the only thing standing between her and a prison cell. I pressed my hand flat against the cool wall to steady myself. The marble felt like ice, but my blood was boiling. Prison. What could Diane have possibly done 30 years ago that would warrant a prison sentence? Kidnappers did not send grieving mothers to prison. So what is the next move? Valerie asked, her voice laced with heavy impatience. Because I am not spending another month tiptoeing around that massive house pretending to care about his feelings. That encounter yesterday was far too close. What if that scammer tries to approach him again? Tommy is not going to approach him again, Bradley said firmly, saying the name that I had never heard before. Tommy. The stranger in the coffee shop had a name. I already wired Tommy his extra consulting fee through the offshore account. He knows the drill. He gets his monthly payout to keep his mouth shut, and he stays far away from Boston. Yesterday was just a warning shot because his payment was 2 days late. I handled it. The puzzle pieces slammed together in my mind with blinding clarity. Bradley knew the man in the coffee shop. Bradley was paying him off. My son was using my money to finance the extortion of my own family. You need to finalize this, Bradley. Valerie demanded, the sound of her heels clicking as she paced across his office floor. We have been waiting for years. I am tired of waiting. When is he officially handing over the reins? Next month, Bradley answered, his tone shifting to one of supreme arrogance. The board meets on the 15th. Dad has already drawn up the succession paperwork. He is transferring the chief executive title and his voting shares to me. We just need to keep paying Tommy until that signature is on the dotted line. Once I have the company, everything changes. And what about Richard? Valerie asked. He is not just going to step aside and plant a garden. He is too controlling. I held my breath, waiting for my son's answer. I waited to hear how the boy I had raised, the boy I had loved and protected, planned to handle his aging father. I have already spoken to a specialist, Bradley said, his voice entirely devoid of any warmth or familial affection. After the transfer, we start laying the groundwork. We document the outbursts. We highlight his obsession with a 30-year-old kidnapping. We slowly build a medical file that points to severe cognitive decline, early onset dementia, paranoia. By the end of the year, I will have medical power of attorney. We will quietly lock Dad in an upscale memory care facility in upstate New York. He will be out of the way, Mom will be under my thumb, and we will finally have complete control of the empire. I stopped breathing. The hallway around me seemed to stretch and distort. My son was not just hiding a horrible 30-year-old secret. He was actively, deliberately extorting his own mother. He was financing the man who had tormented me in the coffee shop. And he was meticulously planning to medically incarcerate me in a psychiatric ward, stripping away my freedom, my mind, and my entire life's work. For a long moment, I stood completely paralyzed outside the oak door. I thought about the decades I had spent sacrificing my own peace of mind to build a fortune large enough to protect them. I thought about the nights I had stayed awake agonizing over where my missing boy was, while my eldest son secretly siphoned my money to bury the truth. Then something inside me irrevocably snapped. The profound, crushing sadness that had defined my life for 30 years completely vanished. The grief evaporated. The confusion burned away. In its place, a cold, calculating, and absolute rage flooded my veins. It was a pure, unadulterated fury that cleared my mind and sharpened my senses to a razor's edge. Bradley thought he was dealing with a clueless, grieving old man. He thought I was a fragile relic who could be easily manipulated with a few tears and a plausible story. He had fundamentally forgotten who I was. He had forgotten that before I was a grieving father, I was a predator in the boardroom. I had crushed men 10 times smarter and far more ruthless than him. I stepped away from the door in utter silence. I did not barge in. I did not scream. Confronting him now would only alert him to his mistake. I needed him to believe his plan was working perfectly. I needed him to feel completely safe right up until the moment I tore his entire world apart. I turned and walked back down the plush carpet of the executive hallway, my face set in stone, ready to dismantle the very family I had spent my life protecting. I would ensure they regretted the day they crossed me. I pushed the heavy oak door open, making sure my hand trembled violently against the brass handle. I let my shoulders slump forward instantly, adopting the exhausted frame of an aging man. I stumbled slightly as I crossed the threshold of Bradley's office, dragging my feet against the plush carpet. I raised my left hand and clutched the fabric of my suit jacket tightly over my chest. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged, letting out a weak gasp. Bradley was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, reviewing a spreadsheet. He looked up, his expression initially flashing with deep annoyance at the unannounced interruption, before he masked it with a look of dutiful concern. He stood up abruptly, pushing his leather chair back. "Dad," he asked, his voice laced with manufactured worry. "What is wrong? Are you all right?" I leaned against a leather guest chair, letting out a long exhale. I pressed 2 fingers to my temple, closing my eyes tightly, as if fighting off intense dizziness. "I need a moment," I whispered, letting my voice crack perfectly. "My heart is racing, Bradley. It feels like a snare drum in my chest. I cannot seem to catch my breath today." Bradley rushed around his desk, placing a steadying hand on my back. He guided me into the chair, playing the role of the devoted, terrified son flawlessly. He poured a glass of water and handed it to me. I took it with shaking hands, letting a few drops spill to sell the performance. "Sip it slowly." "Dad," he instructed gently. "Do you want me to call a doctor? Should I call for an ambulance? Call for war?" I shook my head weakly, taking a slow sip of the cold water. "No," I rasped, leaning my head back against the leather upholstery. "It is not a heart attack. It is just stress. It is the absolute crushing stress of everything that has happened over the last 24 hours. I opened my eyes and looked at my son, projecting an image of total defeat. "That man in the coffee shop, Bradley." I continued, my voice wavering. "The things he said, the document he showed me. It brought all the agony of losing Leo rushing back to the surface. I feel like I am drowning in it again. Seeing that picture and hearing those lies broke something inside me. I cannot function like this. I cannot lead this company when my mind is completely consumed by ghosts from 30 years ago." I watched his face closely. Beneath the mask of filial concern, I saw the undeniable spark of hungry anticipation ignite in his eyes. I let out another weary sigh. "I spoke to my cardiologist this morning." I lied smoothly. "He told me my blood pressure is dangerously high. He said if I do not disconnect immediately, I am going to have a massive stroke. I need to get away, Bradley. I need complete silence and isolation. I am going to take the private jet up to the Hamptons. I am going to spend the next 2 weeks at the oceanfront estate, completely disconnected from the grid. No phones, no emails, no corporate emergencies. Just absolute rest." Bradley nodded sympathetically, though his grip on my shoulder tightened with sheer excitement. "You need to listen to your doctor, Dad," he said smoothly. "Your health comes first. Mom and I will handle whatever that extortionist tries to do next. We will protect you." I looked up at him, offering a weak, grateful smile. "I know you will, son," I whispered. "But I need you to do more than that. I cannot leave the firm rudderless for 2 weeks right before the end of the fiscal quarter. Effective immediately, you have full operational control of the company. You sign the checks and you approve the contracts. Consider it a trial run for your promotion next month." The greed that washed over his face was so potent, it was almost sickening. He tried to suppress his smile, biting the inside of his cheek, but the raw ambition radiated from him like heat. "Are you sure, Dad?" he asked, feigning hesitation. "I am absolutely sure," I replied, standing up slowly. "The company is yours for the next 2 weeks. Do not let me down." I left the corporate headquarters and had my driver take me back to Beacon Hill. When I walked into the mansion, I continued playing the broken ailing patriarch. I found Diane in the master suite. When I told her about my supposed medical episode and the doctor's strict orders to retreat to the Hamptons, she immediately sprang into action. She was the picture of a doting, terrified wife. She rushed to her massive walk-in closet, pulling out my finest linen shirts, my cashmere sweaters, and my tailored trousers, meticulously folding them into my leather travel bags. "Oh, Richard," she murmured, her voice trembling with perfectly calibrated anxiety. "You scared me so much yesterday. I cannot bear the thought of losing you to a heart attack. You have to rest. I will stay here and make sure everything at the house runs smoothly. You just focus on breathing the ocean air and getting your strength back." I stood in the doorway of the closet, watching her pack my clothes. I looked at the same hands that had signed the withdrawal slip to bury my 4-year-old son. Her tears were shed not for the child she discarded, but for the luxurious life she was trying to protect. A wave of absolute revulsion churned in my gut. I wanted to scream at her. I wanted to grab her by the shoulders and demand the truth. But I simply stepped forward and kissed her gently on the forehead. "Thank you, Diane," I said quietly. "I do not know what I would do without you." She smiled, patting my chest. "Just get better, my love," she whispered. "Just get better." An hour later, my private chauffeur loaded my luggage into the trunk of the town car. As we pulled away, I watched Diane through the tinted window. The moment she thought I was out of sight, her posture completely changed. Her worried shoulders relaxed, and the look of concern vanished, replaced by a cold emptiness. She turned and walked back inside, closing the heavy oak door. I raised the soundproof partition. I pulled out my phone and dialed my chief of aviation. "I need a change of flight plan." I instructed, my voice shedding all traces of weakness. "We are not flying to the Hamptons. Reroute the jet immediately. We are going to Washington." I was not seeking rest. I was seeking a weapon. 2 hours later, I walked into an office blocks away from the federal courthouses. Sitting behind a massive desk was Victor Thorne, a ruthless former prosecutor who owed me his career. He stood up, evaluating my face. "Richard," he said smoothly, shaking my hand, "you look like a man preparing for a war." I gripped his hand. "I am not preparing for a war, Victor," I replied. "I am preparing for an execution." Victor Thorne held court in a conference room that operated like a secure fortress. It was positioned exactly 3 floors beneath the busy streets of Washington, a subterranean bunker completely encased in thick, soundproof acoustic paneling and heavily frosted glass. I stood silently at the head of the massive obsidian table, pulling the fragile contents from my leather briefcase. I laid out the printed ledgers from my legacy mainframe, spreading the sensitive documents across the dark wood, like an old general arranging a map for a final desperate battle. I carefully placed the faded withdrawal slip right next to the modern offshore wire transfer codes. Victor stood closely beside me, his sharp dark eyes intensely scanning the highlighted columns. He had spent 15 grueling years as a federal prosecutor, systematically dismantling organized crime syndicates, before shifting to private practice. And he knew exactly what he was looking at. He traced the hidden root of the $50,000 monthly payments with his silver fountain pen, his jaw clenching tightly as he connected the dates. He did not offer any empty platitudes or fake sympathy. He simply looked at me, fully understanding the absolute magnitude of the familial betrayal. "Your own son, Victor," murmured, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble that echoed in the quiet room. "He has been running a highly sophisticated extortion ring directly through your primary corporate accounts, bleeding you dry right beneath your nose." I nodded slowly, leaning heavily against the polished edge of the table to steady my trembling legs. "I need to dismantle his entire operation tonight, Victor." I stated, my voice completely devoid of any paternal warmth. "I need to sever his access to my empire immediately. And I need to know exactly who this Tommy character is. I want every single private communication between Bradley and Valerie monitored around the clock. I want to know exactly what they are planning before they even have the chance to think it." Victor did not hesitate for a single second. He walked straight over to the secure intercom panel embedded in the wall, and firmly pressed a silver button. "Send the specialists in right now," he instructed. Less than a minute later, the heavy reinforced steel door swung open. Two men entered the room carrying heavy military-grade metallic cases. Victor introduced them simply as former federal agents who specialized entirely in digital forensics and corporate espionage. They were men who existed entirely off the grid, men who knew how to crack a secure digital vault without leaving a single trace. I gave them my explicit, unrestricted legal authorization to completely penetrate the Caldwell logistics network. I handed them my master administrative credentials, granting them the highest level of access in the company. The specialists worked with terrifying methodical speed. They rapidly established a highly secure uplink to my corporate servers and began systematically bypassing the expensive firewalls Bradley mistakenly thought he controlled. Within 30 minutes, they had successfully executed a shadow clone of Bradley and his active corporate laptop. They seamlessly mirrored his entire hard drive, instantly capturing every encrypted file, every hidden spreadsheet, and every offshore account routing sequence he had buried. But they did not stop there. Using the administrative backdoor I provided, they infiltrated the mobile carrier networks, establishing a real-time intercept on the personal mobile phones of both Bradley and Valerie. Lines of intercepted text messages immediately began to scroll rapidly across the massive digital monitor mounted on the conference room wall. I stood in total silence, reading the absolute venom my son and his wife were casually exchanging. Bradley had texted Valerie just an hour ago. "The old man is completely isolated in the Hamptons. His doctor says his heart is failing fast. The board meeting is in 2 weeks. Start looking at the brochures for that memory care facility. We need to secure a room in their restricted ward." Valerie replied almost instantly. "Make sure it is the facility with 0 visitation rights. I do not want to deal with his complaints when we sell his ridiculous estate." Reading those cruel words felt like swallowing broken glass, but I welcomed the sharp pain. The pain actively fueled the cold mechanical rage that was currently keeping me standing. I turned away from the glowing monitor and looked directly at Victor. "It is time to starve them," I declared, my voice echoing sharply in the bunker. "I want to initiate a complete unannounced financial freeze on all trust accounts, personal liquid assets, and discretionary corporate funds that Bradley currently believes he controls." Victor nodded in agreement, immediately pulling out a thick stack of legal authorization forms. "We will construct a phantom trust," Victor explained, his pen flying rapidly across the complex documents. "I am going to secretly transfer 80% of your core liquid fortune into a newly formed, completely blind holding company. Bradley will still see the massive account balances on his screen, but it will be a complete digital mirage. The funds will be completely locked down, requiring your physical biometric signature to move a single cent. He will not realize the money is completely inaccessible until he tries to execute his next massive transfer. Furthermore, I instructed my mind rapidly calculating the value of the real estate portfolio. I want you to quietly liquidate the Beacon Hill estate, the Winter Lodge in Aspen, and the private aviation fleet. Sell them to anonymous buyers under strict non-disclosure agreements. Keep the leasebacks active for 30 days, so they suspect absolutely nothing. When Bradley tries to seize my physical assets after his little board meeting, he will find out he is attempting to claim ownership of properties I no longer own. I am going to leave him with absolutely nothing but the clothes on his back and the impending weight of a massive federal indictment." Victor handed me the final document. I signed my name with a heavy definitive stroke, officially executing the silent financial guillotine. As I handed the pen back, one of the cyber specialists suddenly cleared his throat. The sound shattered the focused silence of the room. "Mr. Caldwell," the agent said, his eyes fixed on the rapid scrolling code on his secondary monitor. "We just broke through the final layer of offshore encryption on the Cayman Islands account. We have the true ownership registry for Apex Holdings." I walked over to his workstation, planting my hands firmly on the desk. "Who is it?" I demanded, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. "Who is receiving my money?" The agent clicked a key, and a high-resolution scanned document appeared on the screen. It was a corporate formation charter from 1996. The name of the registered owner was printed in bold black letters. Gregory Barnes. I stared at the name, the breath completely leaving my lungs. The room started to spin. Gregory Barnes was not an anonymous kidnapper. He was not a dangerous, unknown criminal. Gregory Barnes was the man who had served as the private chauffeur for the Caldwell family for over 20 years. He died exactly a year ago. The arrogant grifter Bradley called Tommy was his son Thomas Barnes. The revelation hit me with the force of a freight train. Gregory Barnes. The man had driven my cars, carried my groceries, and smiled at my missing son. He stood quietly in the background of my life for over 2 decades. He offered me his solemn condolences when the police suspended the search for Leo. All the while, he was the ghost behind Apex Holdings. He was the architect of the fake ransom drop, bleeding my empire dry while driving me to corporate meetings. Now his son Thomas Barnes had inherited the family business of extorting the Caldwells. I did not stay in Washington a moment longer. I instructed Victor to maintain the financial lockdown and keep the cyber team monitoring every digital breath my son took. I boarded my private jet under the cover of darkness, flying back to Boston, completely off the radar. The flight was a blur of icy rage. Using the intercepted data from Bradley's cloned laptop, I extracted the burner phone number my son used to communicate with the blackmailer. I did not involve the police. I did not involve security. This was a cancer that required a highly precise personal excision. Upon landing in Boston, I drove directly to an industrial district near the shipping ports. I owned a vast array of properties, including a decommissioned logistics warehouse that sat vacant on the edge of the harbor. It was a cavernous structure of rusting steel and cracked concrete, far removed from the pristine marble of Beacon Hill. It was the perfect stage for a reckoning. I sat in the cold, damp office overlooking the warehouse floor and pulled out a fresh, untraceable mobile phone. I sent a single, precise text message to Tommy. It read, "I know about the $2 million lump sum demand. Bradley is out. I am taking over the payments. Meet me at Pier 4 warehouse in 1 hour. Come alone." I knew from intercepted texts that Tommy was pressing Bradley for a massive payout of $2 million to disappear for good. Bradley was stalling, trying to string the grifter along until the corporate takeover was complete. But Tommy was impatient and reckless. I counted on that greed to override his survival instincts. I unlocked the heavy iron safe in the warehouse office, a relic from my early days of managing cash payrolls. I pulled out 10 banded stacks of $100 bills, $100,000 in sequential crisp currency. I packed the money into a sleek metallic briefcase and snapped the latches shut. The heavy clack echoed loudly in the vast empty space. I walked down the metal stairs to the main floor, the only illumination coming from a single floodlight hanging from the high ceiling. I placed the briefcase on a rusted shipping crate in the center of the pool of light. Then I stood in the shadows, waiting for the ghost of my past to arrive. Exactly 50 minutes later, the heavy corrugated metal doors at the front of the warehouse rattled loudly. A black sports car pulled into the building, its engine roaring unnecessarily before being cut off. The headlights illuminated the dusty air, casting long, menacing shadows against the walls. The driver's side door swung open, and Tommy stepped out onto the concrete floor. He was a tall, heavily built man in his late 30s, wearing a tailored leather jacket over a dark t-shirt. He walked with a swaggering, arrogant confidence that made my blood boil. As he stepped into the circle of light, I finally got a clear look at his face. There was a faint resemblance to my wife Diane around the jawline, a calculated detail he had exploited. But the arrogant tilt of his chin and the cold calculation in his eyes belonged entirely to his father, the chauffeur who had betrayed me. Tommy looked around the empty warehouse, a smug smile spreading across his face. He clearly believed he held all the cards. He thought he had a terrified, broken old man trapped in an inescapable web of family secrets. "Well, well, well," Tommy called out, his voice echoing loudly in the cavernous space. The great Richard Caldwell stepping out of his ivory tower to do business in the dirt. I have to admit, I was surprised when you texted. I figured Bradley would try to keep you shielded from the ugly truth until he had you locked up in that fancy nursing home. I stepped out of the shadows, walking slowly into the light. I did not react to his deliberate provocation. I kept my face entirely neutral, projecting an aura of absolute terrifying control. I stopped a few feet away from the shipping crate, looking him directly in the eye. You demanded $2 million from my son, I stated, my voice low and completely steady. You promised that if you received that lump sum, you would take your fabricated story and disappear forever. Tommy chuckled, running a hand through his hair. It is not a fabricated story, Richard. We both know that. Mom paid the ransom, but the bad guys did not give me back. It is a real tragedy. But hey, I survived, and now I just want my fair share of the family pie. Bradley agreed to the $2 million. If you are stepping in for him, I expect the full amount tonight. Otherwise, the press gets an interesting story about the missing Caldwell heir returning. I reached out and placed my hand flat on the top of the metallic briefcase. I popped the latches with my thumbs. The lid sprang open, revealing the thick stacks of cash. There is exactly $100,000 in this case, I said, keeping my gaze locked entirely on his face. Tommy frowned, his smug expression faltering for a fraction of a second. He looked down at the money, then back up at me. That is not $2 million, old man. That is an insult. Do you really want to test me? I did not blink. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a sterile, sealed medical tube containing a single cotton swab. I tossed it onto the stacks of cash. You get the rest of the money when you give me a DNA sample right now, I demanded, my voice turning to sharpened steel. You can play your little psychological games with Diane. You can extort Bradley because he is a coward. But I do not buy your story for a single second. I do not buy that you are Leo. Swab your cheek or walk out of here with absolutely nothing. Tommy stared at the medical tube. For a moment, the heavy silence of the warehouse pressed down on us. Then the arrogant grifter threw his head back and laughed loudly. He reached down, ripped open the plastic packaging, and scraped the cotton swab aggressively against the inside of his cheek. He tossed the damp swab back onto the table, his eyes gleaming with dark amusement. You are a smart guy, Richard. Tommy smirked, grabbing the handle of the briefcase. Smarter than your wife, anyway. I watched him drive away, dispatching the fresh swab to a highly private rapid testing laboratory. The wait for the laboratory results felt like wading through wet concrete. I had relocated from the damp warehouse to an anonymous suite overlooking the Charles River. Victor Thorne and his cyber specialists had transformed the room into a digital command center. The large windows were blacked out. The plush bed was covered in financial ledgers. The focal point was a bank of monitors mounted along the wall, silently broadcasting a live feed from inside my home. Before I left for my fabricated retreat, Victor's operatives had bypassed the perimeter security of my estate. Under the guise of a network upgrade, they had seamlessly embedded microscopic motion, activated cameras, and highly sensitive audio receivers in every primary living space. The kitchen, foyer, living room, and master suite were now entirely exposed. I sat in an armchair in the dim suite, my eyes locked onto the glowing screens. I was a ghost haunting my own house. For the first 24 hours, the feeds showed exactly what I expected. The house was quiet, meticulously maintained by the daytime staff. But as the sun set and the staff departed, the true reality of my wife's existence became painfully clear. Diane was unraveling. The fragile facade she had so carefully maintained in my presence completely shattered the moment I supposedly boarded a flight. I watched her on the monitor dedicated to the main living room. The grand space was illuminated only by the flickering light of the stone fireplace. Diane was pacing the length of the Persian rug, her steps erratic. She wore a silk robe that hung loosely from her thin frame. In her hand, she gripped a large crystal tumbler filled with dark amber liquid. It was straight bourbon from my private reserve, and she was drinking it with the desperate urgency of a person trying to drown a raging fire in her mind. Her hands trembled so violently that the liquor sloshed over the rim of the glass. She walked to the bay windows, staring out into the dark courtyard, muttering frantically to herself. The audio feeds picked up panicked whispers. She was terrified. She kept looking over her shoulder. I sat in my room watching the woman I had protected over 4 decades, feeling an icy void where my sympathy used to reside. She was not a victim. She was a co-conspirator being crushed by her deceit. Around midnight, the motion sensors in the grand foyer flashed green on my panel. The heavy front doors clicked open. Bradley stepped into the entryway, shaking the rain from his coat. He walked through the house with the arrogant stride of a man who already believed he owned the property. He found his mother in the living room. Diane practically collapsed against the sofa when he walked in, letting out a sharp gasp. Bradley did not offer a comforting hug. He simply stood near the threshold, looking at her with profound, clinical disgust. "You need to pull yourself together, Mom," Bradley commanded, his voice cold and flat. "You are a mess. The staff is going to start asking questions if they find you wandering around like a drunken ghost every morning." Diane shook her head frantically, raising the trembling glass to her lips. She took a desperate gulp. "I cannot do this anymore, Bradley," she sobbed, her voice raw. "I cannot sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see that man. I see the bank receipt. Your father knows something is wrong. He is not a fool. He is sitting up in the Hamptons right now, but I know he is thinking about it. He is going to keep digging." "He is not digging anywhere," Bradley snapped, pouring himself a small scotch. "He bought the ransom story completely. He is exactly where I want him, isolated and utterly dependent on me to run the company. You just need to hold your nerve for a few more weeks." Diane lunged forward, her face twisted in absolute terror. She grabbed the lapels of his leather coat, her knuckles turning white. "You do not understand," she shrieked, her voice echoing sharply. "The ransom story will not hold up if he looks too closely. If Richard finds out what really happened that day at the lake, he will kill me. He will absolutely kill me." I stopped breathing. The air in my room turned instantly to ice. I stared at the monitor, my mind violently rejecting the words that had just left her mouth. The lake. For 30 agonizing years, the official narrative of my son's disappearance had been etched into my soul and into the police reports. Diane had told the detectives that she had taken 4-year-old Leo to the crowded Chestnut Hill shopping mall. She said she had turned her back for a mere 10 seconds to pay for a toy at a kiosk, and when she turned around, the stroller was empty. He was gone. Swallowed by the crowd. The police had scoured the mall and reviewed grainy security footage. The entire investigation had been based on a busy commercial center. There was never a lake. The lake was an entirely different location, an isolated summer cabin we owned miles away from the city, a place we had supposedly not visited in the weeks leading up to the kidnapping. Bradley did not flinch at her words. He forcefully peeled his mother's trembling hands off his coat, pushing her back with a disturbing lack of effort. He stepped closer to her, invading her personal space, towering over her fragile frame. "He won't," Bradley replied, his voice dropping to a menacing, lethal whisper. "Because you are going to keep your mouth shut. You are going to smile, you are going to take your pills, and you are going to play the grieving widow perfectly. Because if you break Mom, if you say one wrong word to him, I will stop paying Tommy. I will let Tommy take his evidence straight to the district attorney. And you will spend your final years locked in a federal penitentiary for what you did. Do you understand me?" Diane whimpered, sinking down onto the cushions of the sofa, curling in on herself like a beaten animal. She nodded slowly, burying her tear-stained face in her hands. "Good," Bradley sneered, turning his back on her. "I am finalizing the corporate transfer paperwork tomorrow. Just stay out of my way." He walked out of the room, leaving his mother weeping in the dim light of the dying fire. I sat frozen in the armchair of my hotel suite, the digital audio static hissing softly through the speakers. My hands gripped the armrests tightly. The magnitude of the deception was massive to process. My son was not merely a greedy executive stealing corporate funds. He was a ruthless blackmailer actively extorting his own mother. He was holding the threat of federal prison over her head to secure his inheritance. But the most horrifying revelation was the geographical slip that shattered 3 decades of accepted reality. The lake. She was the architect of a massive cover-up. I would tear down every lie until I found my son. The morning sun climbed over the Charles River, casting long beams of light into the darkened suite, where I had spent the night watching the destruction of my family unfold on the surveillance monitors. The revelation about the lake still echoed in my mind, a toxic secret that completely unraveled the very foundation of my life. Diane and Bradley had lied about the mall. They had lied about the ransom. They had lied about everything.